A skeleton buried in a stone sarcophagus beneath a parking lot in Beirut sat undisturbed for 2,500 years before construction workers found him in 1994 during post-war rebuilding on the site of the ancient Acropolis of Birsa. Archaeologists called him the Young Man of Birsa, dated his remains to around 500 BCE based on the sarcophagus style and grave goods, and filed him away as one more Phoenician burial among thousands scattered across the ancient Mediterranean world. Nobody expected his bones to eventually overturn assumptions that historians, linguists, and geneticists had all been making, quietly and independently, for well over a century. 4 modern nations: Lebanon, Malta, Tunisia, and parts of coastal Spain, each build a piece of their national identity on descent from this ancient trading civilization. The Phoenicians, in the popular imagination, were the master merchants of the ancient world, alphabet builders, purple dye traders, founders of Carthage, the people who taught the Greeks to write, and then vanished from history books shortly after Rome burned their greatest city to the ground. Genetics has now looked directly at that story. What it found does not erase the Phoenicians. It relocates them. To understand why the DNA results landed as a surprise, you first have to understand how completely the historical record itself is built on an assumption nobody ever directly tested. Phoenicia was never a unified nation-state in the way Egypt or Persia was. It was a loose network of independent city-states along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Arwad, sharing a Semitic language, a set of trading gods, and an economic culture built almost entirely around seafaring commerce. Ancient Greek writers coined the term Phoenician from a word connected to the purple dye these cities were famous for producing, extracted at enormous cost from the glands of murex sea snails and traded as one of the most valuable luxury commodities in the ancient world. The people themselves left almost no surviving texts describing who they considered themselves to be, beyond scattered inscriptions naming their home city, rather than any broader Phoenician identity. A silence that later historians filled in with their own assumptions, largely inherited from the Greek and Roman writers who had every reason to view Phoenician expansion through the lens of their own colonial experience. From these coastal cities, beginning around the 9th century BCE, Phoenician sailors established trading colonies across the length of the Mediterranean. On Cyprus, in Sicily, along the North African coast, on Sardinia, in southern Spain, and most famously at Carthage, on the coast of modern Tunisia, a colony that eventually grew powerful enough to challenge Rome itself for control of the Western Mediterranean during 3 brutal wars in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. The standard historical assumption, repeated in textbooks for well over 100 years, treated this colonial expansion the way most ancient historians treated most colonial expansions, as a movement of people. Levantine sailors from Tyre and Sidon, the story went, settled these distant Mediterranean shores in meaningful numbers, married into local populations at the margins, and planted a genuinely Near Eastern genetic seed across thousands of miles of coastline. Modern populations in Malta, coastal Tunisia, parts of Sardinia, and southern Spain have all, at various points, pointed to this narrative as the biological foundation of a distinctly Phoenician-descended identity. Nobody had actually tested the bones to see if this was true. The Young Man of Birsa gave researchers their first real opportunity. In 2018, a team led by geneticist Pierre Zalua sequenced his full mitochondrial and partial nuclear genome and published results that immediately complicated the settlement narrative. His maternal lineage traced to a rare European haplogroup, one connected most closely to populations from the Western Mediterranean rather than the Levantine homeland his Carthaginian burial should have predicted. He carried ancestry that looked less like a Phoenician who had sailed west from Tyre and more like someone whose family tree already ran through the populations of the region Carthage had colonized. One skeleton is a data point, not a pattern. The pattern came a year later, in 2019, when a much larger study, led by Mark Haber, and published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, analyzed ancient DNA recovered from Punic-era burial sites across Sardinia and Ibiza. Two of the most important Phoenician-founded colonies in the Western Mediterranean, and sites where a distinctly Levantine colonial population, if one had ever existed in meaningful numbers, should have left its clearest genetic signature. It had not. The individuals buried in these Phoenician colonial cemeteries showed genetic ancestry overwhelmingly dominated by local populations already present in Sardinia and Ibiza before Phoenician contact began, mixed with broader ancient Mediterranean and North African genetic currents that had been circulating around the sea for thousands of years before any Tyrian ship set sail. The Near Eastern genetic component specifically associated with the Phoenician homeland. The signature that should mark descendants of actual Levantine settlers appeared at strikingly low frequencies in some sampled populations barely detectable at all. This is the finding that forces a genuine reconsideration of what Phoenician colonization actually looked like on the ground. The Levantine sailors from Tyre and Sidon undeniably built these trading networks, founded these cities, and spread a shared alphabet, religious pantheon, and commercial culture across the length of the Mediterranean. But the people living in the colonies they founded were, generation after generation, overwhelmingly local. Descendants of the populations who had already been living on those coastlines, who adopted Phoenician language, religion, and trading practices without being replaced by a substantial incoming Levantine population. Carthage itself provides the sharpest example of this pattern, and it carries consequences for how an entire ancient superpower gets understood. Rome's great rival, the city that produced Hannibal and nearly ended the Roman Republic before it had properly begun, was founded according to legend by settlers from Tyre under Queen Dido in the 9th century BCE. Roman writers and the centuries of Western historiography that inherited their framework consistently described Carthaginians as ethnically Phoenician, ferocious Semitic outsiders threatening the emerging order of the classical Mediterranean world. Genetic sampling from Carthaginian and broader Punic North African burial sites tells a different story about who actually filled that city's streets. By the time Carthage reached its imperial height in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, the population buried within its territory carried substantial North African genetic ancestry alongside its Levantine cultural inheritance. A population that had absorbed centuries of intermarriage with Berber, Sicilian, and broader Western Mediterranean populations, wearing Phoenician religion and speaking a Punic dialect of the Phoenician language while carrying genetic ancestry that connected them as much to their North African neighbors as to their nominal homeland across the sea. Hannibal Barca, in other words, likely descended from a population that Rome insisted on calling foreign invaders, but that modern genetics suggests was by ancestry substantially rooted in the very Mediterranean world Rome claimed as its own. The war between Rome and Carthage, so often framed in ancient and modern retellings as a clash between two fundamentally different peoples, increasingly looks like a conflict between two political systems built from remarkably overlapping genetic material. Malta offers perhaps the clearest modern test case for what this scientific reframing means for living identity. Maltese national culture has long emphasized Phoenician ancestry as a defining feature. The Maltese language itself descends from Siculo-Arabic rather than Phoenician, but the cultural narrative connecting the islands to their ancient Phoenician trading past runs deep, reinforced by temples, artifacts, and a long tradition of civic pride built around the ancient harbor cities the Phoenicians once used as a Mediterranean way station. Modern genetic studies of the Maltese population show ancestry dominated by broader Mediterranean and North African genetic currents, with the specific Levantine signature associated with actual Phoenician settlers present only faintly, if detectably at all, against a genetic backdrop shaped far more by the peninsula's Sicilian, North African, and broader Southern European neighbors across thousands of years of contact that both predates and postdates the Phoenician trading era specifically. This does not mean Malta's connection to Phoenician history is invented. The archaeology is real. The place names, the harbor infrastructure, the centuries of documented trading contact are not in dispute. What the genetics complicates is the specific biological mechanism through which that connection is often popularly explained. The assumption that modern Maltese identity traces through a substantial population of transplanted Levantine settlers, rather than through a much older local Mediterranean population that Phoenician traders visited, traded with, and culturally influenced without ever replacing. Set the Phoenician case alongside what ancient DNA has already revealed about the Etruscans and the Gauls, and a consistent pattern starts to emerge across the ancient Mediterranean and European world, one that keeps surprising people for the same underlying reason each time. Ancient trade networks, colonial ventures, and even outright conquests moved language, religion, technology, and political structure across enormous distances with remarkable speed and thoroughness. They did not, in case after case now tested directly, move population at anywhere near the scale earlier generations of historians assumed. Culture traveled on ships and along trade roads far faster and far more completely than genes ever did. For the Phoenicians specifically, this means the story was never really about a seafaring people spreading their bloodline across the ancient world. It was about a seafaring people spreading their alphabet, their gods, their ships, and their trading networks across populations who were, in the overwhelming majority of cases, already standing on the shorelines those ships arrived at. Populations who took what the Phoenicians offered, adapted it into something locally their own, and in doing so became, in a cultural sense that the genetics cannot undo, genuinely Phoenician themselves. The young man of Beirut is still in Beirut, in a museum case rather than beneath a parking lot, his genome now more thoroughly documented than the vast majority of people who ever lived and died in the ancient world. He carried, without knowing it, evidence that would eventually complicate a national and cultural narrative that 4 modern countries had spent generations building on an assumption nobody had thought to check. He was not, his bones insist, quite what Carthage's founding legend needed him to be. What he was, instead, is something the ancient sources never had the tools to record. Proof that the greatest maritime trading network of the ancient world moved goods, gods, and an entire alphabet across 3,000 miles of open water far more efficiently than it ever moved people. The ships carried everything except, in any great quantity, the sailors who built them. And the coastlines those ships touched kept their own people, generation after generation, quietly becoming Phoenician on their own terms, in their own blood, long after the last vessel from Tyre had come and gone. 4 nations still look toward that ancient coastline for a piece of their identity, and none of them are wrong to do so. What has changed is only the shape of the connection. Less a matter of shared descent from a single seafaring bloodline, more a matter of shared inheritance from a trading culture so successful at spreading itself that it eventually stopped needing ships at all. The alphabet still carries its name through half the writing systems on Earth. The purple dye is gone, the cities are ruins, and the sailors who once commanded the Western Mediterranean left behind, in the end, not a diaspora of descendants but something rarer and in some ways more remarkable. An idea that traveled faster and further than any population ever could, and that outlived every single person who first carried it aboard a ship.